So where I agree with the mainstream media today is that this is a consequential moment for slippery Starmer. But that's where the agreement ends, I'm afraid, because their analysis is laughable. The idea that Donald Trump is going to change his strong negotiating position on Ukraine because of our robotic, technocratic leader who can't even deliver a speech of consequence without gripping to his notes as if they are Lord Alli, well, it's laughable.
Let me close with one of the voices I mentioned earlier, a patient called Petro from the burns unit that I visited in Kyiv. He said to me, if Ukraine fails, Europe will be next. And that is what is at stake here.
Oh, is it, Starmer? You're not doing a very convincing job. I mean, come on. This is a president who has big plans. He knows that the world order needs to change. And a script-reading globalist like Slippery Starmer, who has admitted prioritizing Davos over his own country, is an enemy to that type of revolution. The irony, of course, is that under a different leader, this would actually be a moment, a real moment for an independent UK outside of the clutches of the European Union, thanks to Brexit, to make our mark in reshaping the world. Because overnight, Trump has gone to war with the EU. Watch.
Mr. President, have you just made a decision on what level you will seek on tariffs in the European Union?
We have made a decision. We'll be announcing it very soon, and it'll be 25%, generally speaking, and that'll be on cars and all of the things. And European Union is a different case than Canada, different kind of case. They've really taken advantage of us in a different way. They don't accept our cars. They don't accept essentially our farm products. They use all sorts of reasons why not. And we accept everything of them. And we have about a $300 billion deficit with the European Union. Now, I love the countries of Europe. I guess I'm from there at some point a long time ago, right? But indirectly, pretty directly too, I guess. But I love the countries of Europe. I love all countries, frankly, all different. But the European Union's been... It was formed in order to screw the United States. I mean, look, let's be honest. The European Union was formed in order to screw the United States. That's the purpose of it. And they've done a good job of it, but now I'm president.
What will happen if these countries or the EU retaliate?
They can't. I mean, they can try, but they can't.
China did. They
are
imposed
pledging
tariffs
to, sir.
That went into effect. China's retaliatory tariffs on the 10th of February. Has there been any impact that you've been able to observe?
That's right. No, they can do it, and they can try, but the numbers can never equal what ours, because we can go off. We are the pot of gold. We're the one that everybody wants, and they can retaliate, but it cannot be a successful retaliation because we just go cold turkey. We don't buy anymore. And if that happens, we win.
But we have the wrong prime minister at the wrong time, who will not capitalize on that moment, because Starmer is going to pretend to the world in the next few minutes that we're on the same page, when that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, listen to Trump completely rule out the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, a statement that will horrify Starmer, even though I believe it's eminently sensible.
Our equipment, that would have been over very quickly.
What concessions would you like to see? What concessions would you like to see?
Oh, I don't want to tell right now, but I can tell you that NATO you can forget about. I think that's probably the reason the whole thing started. And I think, JD, we can say that. Do you have a statement on that? You've been very much involved. I gave him the beauty.
Great. Maybe the hardest question, sir. I mean, look, as the president said, we're not going to do the negotiation in public with the American media. He's going to do it in private with the president of Russia, with the president of Ukraine, and with other leaders. And I think that's how this has to go. I think that...
Indeed, Starmer is on very shaky territory, given his strategy before flying out to Washington, D.C. last night was to lambast Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK and Trump's closest British political ally, for being too close to Russia and Putin.
In July, Reform UK fought the election on a policy to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 and 3% of GDP after 2030, funded by a £6 billion saving in the aid budget. You said you'll do similar. You'll increase defence spending to 2.5% by 2027, 3% after 2030, funded by a £6 billion cut in the aid budget. Are you Nigel Farage in disguise?
Nigel Farage didn't even turn up to the debate in Parliament today. Nigel Farage is fawning over Putin. That's not patriotism. That is not what working people need. What I've done is take the duty of Prime Minister seriously.
I mean, good luck trying to justify that sort of approach to Donald Trump in a few minutes' time, because Starmer is speaking the language of the Russian hoax proponents who spent years wrongly trying to accuse Trump of being in cahoots with Putin after his first election. Now the left and the MSM clearly intend to use the same strategy here to stop Farage as reform storms to the top of the polls. Despite the MSM and political analysts who are always wrong, like Dan Hodges, pretending Trump's desire to end the war with Ukraine would have a negative knock-on effect on Farage in the polls, that is not proving to be the case. Like the new Find Out Now poll today actually shows Reform extending its lead ahead of Labour. Look at that. Reform on 28%, Labour 23%, the Conservatives 21%. So Starmer hasn't realised it, and he never will. And the mainstream media will continue to believe they still control the narrative. But the reality is that Trump will be lauded, I believe in the end, for ending an unnecessary and costly war for which he should win the Nobel Peace Prize if he achieves it. That was a suggestion Scott Jennings made to much uproar on the dying CNN.
I'm willing to give the new administration some latitude to try to enact the political will of the people of the United States, and that is for this to come to an end. The political will to continue to funding an open-ended engagement is draining rapidly. I think you would acknowledge that. And so Trump here is a new broker on the field and has a chance to do something amazing, and that is to get these two people to stop fighting, and in that case would bring some stability to the continent of Europe. And, you know, what he has to say publicly about Russia or Ukraine over the course of time, I guess I'm willing to give them some latitude if the ultimate result is this, what Pete Hegseth said initially, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine, those were his words. The United States strikes a rare earth mineral deal with Ukraine. I would love that. And the governments in Europe decide that they do need to take a little more responsibility for their own national security. If these are the outcomes and the killing stops, they ought to give Donald Trump the Nobel Peace Prize.
The narrative over Ukraine and Russia has been distorted by the mainstream media and the political elites for their own end for far too long, at far too great a cost. It's time to realise the problem is far more nuanced than they will ever present. And to make that point, I am delighted today to be joined by Jonathan Haslam for our Uncancelled Interview. And as we stand by for Keir Starmer's arrival at the White House this afternoon, let me bring in Jonathan Haslam, Fellow of the British Academy and Emeritus Professor in the History of International Relations at at the University of Cambridge. He is one of the world's greatest experts on Russian foreign policy and espionage, and his best-selling new book, Hubris: The Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine, examines one of the most intractable issues of our time. And it is a delight to welcome him to Outspoken at such a critical juncture of this war as we await Starmer arriving at the White House to make the case to President Trump. Jonathan, your contention in this book is that actually the origins of this war in Ukraine date right back to the early 90s when we saw the US administration under Bill Clinton push for Ukraine to join NATO. So what do you make of Trump categorically ruling that out? I mean, you would have seen it there. It's not even a possibility during his time in the White House.
Yes, it's a fascinating turnaround. And the key point is that when the Americans, in secret, provided for Ukraine to enter NATO. This was in October 1994, if you can think back that far. They never asked the Ukrainians. They made these decisions, who was going to enter NATO. They just wanted to expand NATO, to expand American power in the world, and Ukraine was just a small part of it. And they had no idea what was going to happen. The Clinton administration had absolutely no foresight about this whatsoever. But of course, this was before Putin came to power. Putin didn't come to power for another 6 years. So Putin picked up a problem that pre-existed his advent to power. Whatever you think of Putin, this was a problem for Russia.
Well, indeed, indeed. And so when Starmer continues this narrative against Putin, right? You saw what he had to say about Nigel Farage, for example. How does that go down in Russia? And is it a sensible approach, or is the Trump strategy far more sensible in terms of actually achieving peace?
Yeah, this is, as you said earlier, you said it very well. I mean, how does Keir Starmer imagine Britain's image is vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis the US president? I mean, we're tiny. We don't figure in any large sense. There is no such thing as the special relationship. When I first went to America to work there in 1984, I asked someone about it. In fact, he was the man who advised Dean Acheson in the early 50s. I said, so what's the special relationship? And he said, there isn't one. Yes. There's a sort of dream world the British Whitehall lives in about the special relationship. And it's, even if we did have, and we do have, very close relations in secret intelligence, for example, but so do the Australians. It's are we going to compare ourselves with them? I think not. Starmer is certainly not going to do so. So there's a sort of lack of realism about British policy, which is truly worrying. And you can say what you like about Trump. You should never listen to what he says. You should just look at what he does. And what he does is usually pretty effective. Mm-hmm. And this is where Starmer has nothing to counterbalance him with, nothing at all. In fact, Macron, whom the Americans call Macron for some reason, Macron has more pull in Washington, as we saw, than Starmer, as we shall see. But of course, Trump is going to be very polite to him. He just won't give way.
How frustrating has it been for you, as one of the world's experts on Russia, who knows all of the background about Ukraine, to see the way that the mainstream media has been so intransigent, really, when it comes to reporting the truth of this issue? I mean, some of the reviews for your book were just laughably horrible because you don't parrot the narrative.
Yes, well, you can blame Whitehall for that. And it's a vestige of the Wuhan virus, which of course was a Chinese virus. Mm-hmm. It's a vestige of Wuhan virus that we have in Whitehall all sorts of bodies supposedly dealing with disinformation. Disinformation means information the government doesn't like and can't control. So exactly what Vice President Vance said about Europe is our problem in Britain. Not only do we lock people up or police approach people for saying nasty things on the media, but our media is subservient. Our mainstream media is as subservient to Whitehall as Vance would have suggested.
And so what have we missed as a result of the mainstream media coverage of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? I mean, let me speak from my personal experience, Jonathan. As you know, I've done a lot of research on this recently. But at the beginning, I sort of very briefly brought into that narrative that Zelensky was some type of heroic figure. In fact, can you just talk a little bit about the corruption in Ukraine, some of the state-sanctioned killings in Ukraine, and the fact that actually it's far too simple to try and present Russia versus Ukraine as a straight good versus evil battle? But first, the reason you're watching this show is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to trust mainstream media or the so-called fact checkers who claim to determine which facts are true. And there's good reason for that, given the debate over free speech, the controversy surrounding Brexit, and how Trump and other politicians challenging the status quo are portrayed. But I have the solution. It's called Ground News, and it's the best way to stay informed and cut through media bias and narratives so you can get the facts for yourself. Go to ground.news/outspoken to check it out. But I just want to show you this incredible app and website in action. So let's take the game-changing speech by US Vice President J.D. Vance to the Munich Security Conference, where he tore into European governments, including ours here in the UK, for the despicable retraction of free speech. You can see clearly in one place that 361 sources are covering the story. Ground News instantly shows how the story is being covered by the media, broken down by whether it leans to the left or the right, illustrated by its bias distribution service. If you scroll down, you can see every article about this topic broken down by the political position and ownership of the publication. So we can see for ourselves quite clearly that Newsmax and GB News gave fair and accurate coverage, focusing on how Vance finally had the guts to point out uncomfortable truths to European leaders. By stark contrast, the left-wing HuffPost claimed the speech left all of Europe aghast, while The Independent missed the lead altogether to focus on Vance's joke about Elon Musk, which he claims bombed. What's more, Ground News gets to know you personally, providing you with the news stories you're interested in while also analysing your own biases. My favourite feature is their blind spot feed, which surfaces upwards of 20 stories daily that you might not be hearing about because of the corruption of the mainstream media. Now, I know you love the news. That's why you're watching Outspoken, but like me, you don't trust the legacy media. So Ground News gives you the tools to understand the truth about what is going on in the world. It is the only way I read the news, allowing you to see through media bias and manipulative narratives, no more relying on MSM bias to define the truth for you. So go to ground.news/outspoken to check it out. Subscribe through my link for 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use for unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, and supporting my sponsors also supports my work. So for less than a Netflix subscription, you can get all of the world's news in one place and think for yourself. Thank you, Ground News. This has been a total game changer for me. So let me just repeat the address: ground.news/outspoken. But now, back to the show.
Well, I think, Walter, how far we go back. Ukraine was the largest recipient of American foreign aid from 1994 all the way through to 2014. When you deluge a country, you deluge its elite, you deluge its government with vast amounts of money, no good can come of it, and no good has come of it. Having said that, Russia, of course, is under a frightening dictatorship. You wouldn't in no sense want to live there. Working there is impossible in any sort of freedom. And Putin did the worst thing imaginable by attacking Ukraine. And he handed Russia's enemies a gift, which was basically, pull out the old saw about Russia wanting to take over the whole of Europe. That is completely laughable. The idea that after Ukraine, Mr. Putin is waiting breathlessly to enter another war to take over parts of Europe is an absurd fantasy. It's absolutely ridiculous. The Russian economy, it's on its face. I mean, the Russian economy is in a terrible state. Russian businessmen, who is trying to pull them together in Saudi Arabia for talks with the Americans, along with the Saudis. It's the man in charge of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. Where was he educated? Stanford, Harvard. You can imagine people like that living and working in Russia do not want the current state of things to continue and are willing to make sacrifices to get this ended. And this is our hope, really, is that the forces within Russia that you won't see on screen, Putin ensures that you don't see him on screen in Russia, these people are a power lobby and they're pushing for a deal. And in my view, they will in the end get it.
And what do you think that deal will look like? And actually, what does it need to look like to achieve a lasting peace?
This is tough. It's easier to start negotiations than to draw them to an end. Well, there are several things. First of all of these sanctions against Russia, which are really reducing its economy to a terribly primitive state, they're a big handle that Trump has in the negotiations. There's the fighting, and Ukraine and Russia, it seems to me, their youth of their country has been destroyed by this war. The grandmothers, the mothers, the relatives. You think of all the people who have stood on the sidelines watching the coffins return on both sides. This is horrendous. So on both sides, public opinion wants an end to the war. So that works on both sides. On the issue of territory is critical, the issue of territory. You'll remember that when the Americans helped launch a coup d'etat which overthrew the Ukrainian government in February 2014, and you need to read about that in my book. It's elsewhere, but you'll find it in my book. They launched a coup d'etat to remove a constitutionally set up government in Ukraine. It was a terrible government, but name me a good Ukrainian government. They overthrew it and put in their people, the people they were allied with, and then the other people were thrown out. So as a result of that, Putin acted swiftly and seized the Crimea in the Black Sea, this peninsula out in the Black Sea where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is located. He rushed out, seized it, and then waited. And President Obama did nothing. He did nothing. He was asked, he was pressed by some of his subordinates, not the ones who were working in the last regime, but more junior subordinates at the Pentagon. Can't we go in and do something? He said, no, we're not going to do it. So they offered no opposition. So Putin took Crimea. The Russians have always claimed Crimea since the end of the Soviet Union. This is a sore point in Russia. Ukrainians never really colonized the Crimea. It was the Russians who colonized Crimea. So Russians regard it as theirs. So that part of Ukrainian territory, I think, is unlikely to go back to Ukraine.
Totally.
But there's the territory just opposite on the other side of the Black Sea, eastern Ukraine, there is a very large population. Well, goodness only knows how large it is after the fighting, a large population of Russian speakers who are not necessarily Russians, but they identify with Russian culture. The question is, what happens to them? They're part of this territory that Russia has annexed and passed all sorts of legislation to keep it part of Russia. There's no way we can have peace between Russia and Ukraine if that territory remains in Russian hands. The Russians have to disgorge that territory. I don't know how to do it, but they have to think of ways of doing it. For example, at the end of the war, Trieste was an area of dispute between Yugoslavia and Italy. And in the end, you had a form of international control over the territory for a period of time. And it seems to me the only way of dealing with those eastern Ukrainian territories is to have some form of joint international control over them, not NATO so-called peacekeepers. The idea the British Army, I mean, goodness only knows the British Army, if you spread them out one by one, wouldn't cover a 50th of that territory.
Totally.
The German army, whatever.
No, I mean, it was a completely insane prospect, which obviously Starmer went for. Now, just if you're joining us momentarily, you'll see the flags are now out at the White House. Keir Starmer arriving for his first meeting with Donald Trump since he became US president, as the situation, the crunch talks over the future of Ukraine and Russia meet a critical juncture. Now, Jonathan Haslam, it feels like the biggest disagreement between Trump and Starmer is over the characterization of Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator, because he has not held democratic elections since the start of the war. Where do you stand on that?
Yes, I think this was a very unfortunate thing to say. We didn't have an election during World War II when we were on our backs, and even though there was severe opposition to Churchill from the left of the Labour Party. So I just think that was unfair. It came out of anger because when he sent his Treasury Minister to Ukraine to try to do a deal on these rare earth materials kept in parts of Ukraine, to buy for the United States to have them in return for all the money it spent in Ukraine, he was treated, how shall I say? I mean, Zelensky was just totally rude to him, as though this were just some minion from Washington. That was a huge mistake. You know yourself from watching everything that Trump does. It's all about image. It's about prestige. And if some small country relative to the United States is going to scorn an envoy of his, they're in trouble. And I'm afraid this unfortunate word dictator was just a sort of verbal retaliation, which he won't withdraw. It's a deliberate insult.
Okay, but then what about the fact, Jonathan, though, that Zelensky punishes his political rivals, that some journalists have been silenced, that there is the suggestion of state-sanctioned killings in Ukraine. Now, that doesn't necessarily put him on a level as bad as Putin, but it just feels to me like the mainstream media ignore the corruption in Ukraine altogether. And certainly Starmer does when he writes the blank checks.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, Ukraine is not whiter than white. I have Ukrainian friends on various sides of the picture. It's no place to be if you oppose the Ukrainian president's point of view. It really isn't. You're best out of the country. But at a time when Trump refuses to call Putin a dictator and he calls Zelensky a dictator, this is a huge misstep in terms of world opinion and American opinion. But I think those on the ground, those who deal with these things, won't take them too seriously. I mean, Zelensky knows perfectly well that he has avoided the electorate, and he also knows perfectly well that he has a major problem of corruption. His defense ministry, he got rid of people, as I say, he threw them out. There have been Russian spies, you must remember, within the Ukrainian regime. The Russians seeded Ukraine with foreign intelligence operatives. Their neighbors, the place is full of them. And I don't think Zelensky has found half of them yet. So he's not been in a great position. I don't agree with whitewashing him either. I think. But I think in this big business, it's a bit of a red herring. In the end, who's going to decide this? Who's going to decide this peace? Trump and Putin. No one else. I mean, Zelensky will be invited.
Just stand by, because I think we'll take this sound up now, because Donald Trump, I believe we will see, has just arrived on the steps of the White House. Now, this is very significant, Jonathan Haslam, because you'll remember just 2 days ago, Trump did not turn up to welcome President Macron to the White House. So the red carpet is being rolled out for Keir Starmer, who is about to pull up at the White House for his first meeting with President Trump. Here's the car. And as I say, Macron was made to walk in on his own with no real welcome. Here's Starmer emerging. Let's see if we can listen in to what's said.
President Trump, can you get a peace deal done in Ukraine?
Yes.
How confident are you, sir?
Yeah, we will. Thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister, will you get a backstop with you?
Okay, so quite a big moment. Big moment. Trump did arrive on the steps of the White House to welcome Starmer, something that was not done for President Macron. The question, very simple to Donald Trump, will you get a peace deal? He replies, yes, we will. When Starmer, Jonathan Haslam, is asked, will you get a backstop? He just turns around and walks inside, because we're not going to get, Europe is not going to get a backstop from Trump.
Yes. If I could fill in with a few words.
Please.
If we roll back to the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, the American intelligence have predicted this for a number of months. And just before it happened, the former Israeli prime minister went to see Putin to dissuade him from invading. And Putin, he was very polite to him, but he said, no, no, no. And then the Russians went in, and they thought they'd take Ukraine in a matter of days. Mm-hmm. So in other words, Putin was completely thrown by this. This was a very good time to move in and get something done. And that's what the Israeli prime minister proceeded to do in March and April. And he got a deal ready with Zelensky before so many boys died. But I mean, and what happened? Boris Johnson arrives in Kiev and says, no, don't sign this. And he did so in the name of NATO, in the name of the United States, because Mr. Biden didn't want to be seen operating in this fashion.
And what was Boris Johnson's motivation? I mean, was it all this personal idea that I'm going to be Churchillian and I'm going to stop this war? Why did he do that? Because, look, I was a supporter of Boris in many ways, but it actually makes me so angry when I think of the damage that has been done to the international economy, to the lives that have been lost. There should have been a peace deal then. It's not like this new peace deal is going to be much different.
No, I think you're right. This was Naftali Bennett was a very smart man. He talked to everybody. He was willing to persuade Putin to get together with Zelensky. He was extremely smart in doing so, and the British undid it. You remember when the attack occurred, NATO reacted, well, most NATO countries, the leading countries of NATO, like a rabbit caught in the headlights in the middle of the road and just froze. And Washington, of course, had Biden in charge, and Biden, as you know, was not quite of a normal state mentally. Yep. He was slow to everything. And so nothing was happening. And the British, at the British Ministry of Defense, they took the initiative and launched plans to react to the invasion, quite extensive plans. And in those plans, which I've seen a copy of, courtesy of the Russians, they published it on their news site. They managed to get hold of a copy. Was basically, we're going to put Britain on the map. In other words, the invasion was going to give Britain an opportunity to take the lead in NATO, which it did in training Ukrainian troops, in covert operations and all the rest of it. So for about 9 months or so, Britain really took the lead till the United States caught up. But we're ahead of our European partners. So you can see that Whitehall, for a sort of fantasy 6 months, thought that somehow Britain was back and Britain would lead. And what you're seeing in Starmer's comments is a sort of reflection of this sort of lunatic imperial mentality. The Russians saw all these plans. That's why in the Russian media, instead of attacking the Americans over Ukraine, they spent most of their time attacking Britain. And it's very funny, in the Russian newspaper today, they talked about Keir Starmer. They hadn't even bothered to look up his first name properly. So I'm afraid Britain is not what Whitehall would want it to be in this situation. We're going to be sidelined, and you can bet your bottom dollar that our new ambassador will do his best to make sure that we are 100% with Trump, 100%. So whatever Trump does, we will echo. And that is the tradition of our relationship with the Americans since the Suez Crisis of 1956. We're the poodle, they hold the lead. And this will be reasserted at this meeting between Starmer and Trump.
But given your book, Jonathan, makes the point that it was this push by the US for NATO entry from 1994 onwards that was the origin of the war that we still see raging today. Can you understand why it has become such a bottom line for people like Boris Johnson, for the mainstream media? Even Nigel Farage is now, and this really surprised me, is raising the possibility of Ukraine entering NATO. Why does our political class believe that is so essential?
Well, you could say it's a sort of position fought before and after the war. The point is that the great leaders of mainstream media have never bothered, all the way through this since 1994, to ask some basic questions. Where did this come from? Who started it? How long has it been going on for? Should we support it? They just don't ask questions. It's mind-boggling. There are plenty of people like myself, but in the United States, who could have helped them answer those questions. In other words, totally incurious. And they just want to hit the Russians. So somehow, if you've got to stand tall by saying Ukraine must be in NATO without understanding this is all rooted in the United States' determination to have Ukraine in NATO. That's why only the United States can negotiate this away with Russia, with Putin. And the point is, this opposition to Ukraine in NATO didn't originate with Putin. It originated in the 90s with Rutskoy and Boris Yeltsin, and carried forward by Putin. In other words, it's an issue between states. It's not an issue just between statesmen. It's an issue in Russia of the national interest. So if you say, well, we can do anything you like for an agreement as long as Ukraine stays in NATO, even Mr. Zelensky has grandly offered to stand down if Ukraine goes in NATO. Well, what an utterly bizarre proposal. It shows absolutely no understanding of international relations at all. If Canada had joined the Warsaw Pact, do you think the United States would have just sort of gone along with it?
Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please click on my face just to the bottom left to subscribe to this brand new independent news source and turn on the notification bell so you'll be alerted to our brand new live shows, uncancelled interviews, and special royal episodes. Outspoken is also now available as a podcast, so you can listen to the show every weekday on the go, wherever you are.